He glanced around the dimly lit room. The air smelled stale, and the faint hum of distant machinery echoed in the background. There were no windows, no obvious exits, just a few flickering overhead lights that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. The walls were bare except for some faded graffiti that had probably been there for years. It felt like he had been transported to a different world, one that had no place for justice, law, or order. The men who had captured him remained silent, standing just out of his direct line of sight. Lawson could hear them talking in low voices, their words muffled, but he couldn't make out anything they were saying. He tried to remain calm, but the uncertainty of the situation gnawed at him. He had no idea what they wanted, and the longer he sat there, the more his mind began to spiral with all the possible scenarios. For the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable. As the Chief Justice, he had always prided himself on being in control. He had spent his career navigating the complexities of the law, making difficult decisions, and standing firm in the face of pressure. But now all that power seemed distant and irrelevant. It didn't matter how many cases he had won, how many speeches he had given about justice, it meant nothing here. In this moment, he was just another man, tied to a chair at the mercy of people who saw him as the enemy. After what felt like hours, one of the men stepped forward. He was tall with a thick build, and his face was hidden behind a black mask. He had a menacing presence, and his eyes, though partially obscured, were cold and unyielding. "You're probably wondering why you're here," the man said, his voice gruff. "Well, I'll tell you. You're not just some judge. You're a symbol of everything that's wrong with the system that's failed us, the system that's rigged against people like us." Lawson didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. The man's words were laced with anger and resentment, but they didn't make sense. "What do you mean?" "I've spent my life fighting for fairness, for justice. I've worked to make the system better, not worse." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Fairness, justice? Those are just words to keep people like you in power. You don't care about fairness or justice. You care about keeping things the way they are, the way they've always been." Lawson felt a surge of frustration, but he fought to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't afford to lose control. "I've dedicated my life to making the system better, to making sure it works for everyone, no matter who they are. If you think that's wrong, then you're mistaken." The man's expression didn't change. He was unmoved by Lawson's words. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're above it all, above people like us, but you're just as much a part of the problem as anyone else." Lawson took a deep breath, trying to understand what was driving this man, what fueled his hatred. He had heard the frustrations of people who felt overlooked, who believed the system was stacked against them. But to go this far, to kidnap someone who represented the very law they seemed to be rejecting, seemed extreme, even irrational. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" Lawson asked, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for the others to step closer. There were 4 of them in total, and they gathered around Lawson, each of them keeping a tight hold on their weapons. They were all silent, watching him closely, waiting for something. One of the other men finally spoke up. "We want change. We want to send a message. People like you think you're untouchable. But you're not. No one is." His voice was bitter, filled with disdain. "The system you protect is broken, and we're going to show the world just how broken it really is." Lawson tried to steady his breathing. These men weren't interested in negotiating or hearing his side of things. They had a plan, and he was the centerpiece of it. He needed to think fast, to figure out a way to turn this around before things escalated any further. "Listen to me," Lawson said, his voice firm. "What you're doing won't solve anything. Violence won't fix the system. It'll only make things worse. The law is the only way we can change things. If you want change, then we need to work within the system, not outside it." The men exchanged looks, but none of them seemed convinced. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm that was about to break. Lawson could feel it in his bones. These men weren't interested in listening. They were too far gone in their anger, their hatred of everything the law stood for, and in their minds, he was the embodiment of everything they despised. One of the men stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of a weapon. "You don't get to tell us what to do," he sneered. "You've had your chance. Now it's our turn." Lawson felt a rush of fear, but he quickly suppressed it. He couldn't afford to show weakness now. He had to stay calm. "Please think about what you're doing. You don't want to go down this road. There's always another way. You can still turn back. But it was clear that they weren't listening. They had made up their minds. Lawson's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of the situation. These men weren't going to release him. They weren't going to listen to reason. And as much as he wanted to believe in the power of his words, he knew that he was facing a crisis much bigger than himself. He sat in the chair, bound and helpless, knowing that his fate was now in the hands of these men. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last as the weight of the moment settled over him. There was nothing more he could do. The men continued to circle around him, their movements calculated, their faces hard. They weren't here for a conversation. They weren't interested in understanding. They had a mission, and that mission was to send a message that would echo far beyond this warehouse. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. Lawson sat still, his mind racing, trying to find any opportunity to turn the situation around. But the men around him seemed resolute, unmoved by his pleas. He could feel the weight of their glares, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger, hatred, and a sense of righteousness. They were convinced that what they were doing was just, that this was the only way to make the system take notice. The man who had been speaking earlier, the one who seemed to be the leader, stepped closer. His boots clacked on the concrete floor with each step, echoing in the silence that hung between them. Lawson's eyes flicked up to meet his, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he seemed to take pleasure in the control he held over the situation. "You still don't get it, do you?" the man said, his voice low and cold. "You think you're different. You think you're above it all, but you're just another cog in the machine, another part of the system that's let people like us suffer for too long." Lawson's mind spun, trying to process the words. He had spent his entire career trying to balance fairness and justice, trying to bridge the gap between people and the law. But these men, consumed by their own rage and pain, couldn't see beyond their own narrow view. To them, the law wasn't a tool for justice, it was a tool of oppression. "I understand that you're angry," Lawson said, his voice steady despite the growing sense of dread that gripped him. "But this isn't the way to fix things. Violence only perpetuates the cycle. You've been hurt by the system, but the answer isn't to destroy it. It's to make it better." The man let out a bitter laugh, one that made Lawson's skin crawl. "Make it better? You think we can fix something that's been broken for so long? You've had your chance. Your system has failed us. You've failed us." Lawson's chest tightened. He could hear the pain in the man's voice, a pain that was too deep to ignore. But no matter how much he sympathized with the frustration, he knew that what these men were doing was wrong. They were only deepening the divide, turning their pain into anger that would only hurt more people in the end. "Please," Lawson said, his voice softening. "I know the system isn't perfect. I know it's broken in many ways. But there are people working every day to make it better. I'm one of those people. And if we want to fix the system, we need to work together, not tear it down." The man's eyes flashed with anger, and he took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't get to tell us what to do. You've spent your whole life telling people what's right and wrong. But you don't understand what it's like on the other side. You don't understand the struggle, the pain, the injustice. You're just a part of the system that keeps us down." Lawson's heart sank. He had heard these arguments before, from people who had felt marginalized, ignored, and betrayed by the system. He had worked tirelessly to address those issues, but it was clear that these men weren't interested in dialogue. They were only interested in revenge. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, as the men seemed to deliberate in their own quiet way. Lawson's eyes darted between them, trying to gauge their next move. He knew that he had to stay calm, that any sign of weakness could be used against him, but deep down he could feel the fear creeping in. Suddenly, one of the other men spoke up. His voice was quieter, more hesitant than the leader's, but it carried an edge of uncertainty. Maybe we're going too far," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "Maybe we don't need to do this. Maybe there's another way." The leader turned sharply, his expression hardening. "Don't be stupid," he snapped. "We're already this far in. There's no turning back now." Lawson's eyes widened slightly at the shift in tone. There was a crack in the man's resolve, a small opening, and Lawson was quick to seize it. "Listen to him," Lawson urged, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to go through with this. You can still make a choice. It's not too late to stop. I know you're hurting. I know you're angry. But violence won't heal those wounds. It'll only make them worse." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The men exchanged looks, unsure of how to proceed. Lawson's heart pounded in his chest. This was his chance. This was the moment he needed to reach them, to show them that there was another way. But before anyone could speak again, the leader snapped his fingers and two of the men moved quickly, grabbing Lawson by the arms and forcing him to his feet. The movement was swift, deliberate, and unyielding. Lawson tried to resist, but the men were too strong. His mind raced, but his body felt sluggish, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, making it harder to think clearly. Enough talk, the leader growled. You had your chance. Now it's time to show you what happens when you protect a broken system. The other men nodded in agreement, and Lawson felt his stomach twist. He could see where this was headed, and it wasn't good. The group had made up their minds. They weren't going to listen to reason. They were going to make a statement, one that would send shockwaves through the country. Lawson's breath quickened as they pushed him toward the center of the room, his thoughts racing. What could he do? What could he say? The ropes around his wrists were biting into his skin, and he struggled to free himself, but it was no use. His mind was still clear, still searching for an opening, for a way to turn the tide, but the more he thought, the more hopeless it seemed. As they moved him closer to the back of the warehouse, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Another man, standing near the far corner of the room, his face covered in shadows. He looked out of place, different from the others. His stance was not one of anger, but one of hesitation. He was looking at Lawson with a mixture of confusion and guilt. This new figure seemed like a wild card, a possible ally. Lawson's eyes locked onto him for a moment, silently pleading for some sign, some indication that there was still a chance to escape. But the moment was fleeting. The leader's harsh voice broke the silence once again. You're wasting your time, the leader spat, dragging Lawson forward. This is bigger than you. This is bigger than all of us. The man in the corner didn't move, his face unreadable, but Lawson held on to that brief moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone among them who could see reason. But for now, it was unclear if that hope would ever become reality. The tension in the room seemed to build with every passing second. Lawson's mind raced, his heart thudding in his chest as the men around him prepared to take the next step. His body ached from being bound to the chair for so long, but his thoughts were clear. He had to find a way to survive this. If he could just hold on a little longer, if he could stay calm and think rationally, maybe there was still a chance. The leader of the group, the man who had been calling the shots all along, motioned to the others. They all moved into position, their eyes locked on Lawson, who could feel the weight of their gaze like a physical presence. He wasn't sure what they had planned next, but the air in the warehouse felt like it was charged with the promise of something dangerous. Get him up, the leader barked, his voice cold and commanding. It's time to make an example. Two of the men moved quickly, pulling Lawson roughly from his seat and forcing him to stand. He winced at the pain in his legs, the stiffness from being tied for so long making every movement a struggle. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear. He needed to buy more time. He had to find a way to turn the situation around, to break through to these men before it was too late. Please, Lawson said, his voice steady, despite the rising fear in his chest. You don't have to do this. Whatever your grievances are, they won't be solved by hurting me. If you want change, there are better ways. There's always a way to make things right, but this is not it. The leader didn't even flinch. He simply nodded to the others, who began to pull Lawson toward the back of the warehouse. Lawson's heart pounded louder in his ears with each step they took. The cold concrete under his feet a stark reminder of just how dire the situation had become. As they neared the far corner of the room, Lawson's eyes darted around, looking for anything that might help him escape. There was nothing, just shadows and more shadows, a desolate, empty space that felt like it had been abandoned for years. His mind worked quickly, but every plan he considered seemed futile. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and tied down. Still, he refused to give up. Not yet. The man who had been silent up until now, the one in the corner, standing apart from the others, stepped forward. His movements were hesitant, almost reluctant. He didn't look like the rest of the men. There was something different about him, something that made Lawson feel like he could reach him. The leader turned toward him, his voice sharp. What's your problem? We're not backing out now. The man didn't answer right away. He simply stood there looking at Lawson. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Lawson could only describe as doubt. Lawson seized the opportunity, focusing all his attention on this man. "I know you don't want to be part of this," he said, his voice low but clear. "I can see it in your eyes. You don't want to do this. There's still time to walk away. You can stop this right now. You don't have to be a part of this violence." The man's gaze flickered again, this time a little longer. Lawson could see the struggle inside him, the internal conflict that was playing out in real time. The leader, however, wasn't about to let him back out. He stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "You really think he's going to listen to you?" The leader taunted. "You're wasting your time. This is bigger than all of us. It's bigger than you." But Lawson could see the uncertainty in the man's eyes now. He wasn't as sure as he had been before. His hands trembled slightly, his fists clenched at his sides, and for just a second Lawson thought that maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. Then, without warning, the door to the warehouse slammed open. The sound echoed through the room, and for a moment everything froze. Lawson's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the noise, wondering if it was a rescue, if help had finally arrived. But instead of the sound of footsteps or the shout of authority, there was only silence. The men in the room tensed, their heads turning toward the door. Lawson's hope faltered as a single figure stepped into the dim light. It was another man dressed similarly to the rest, but his body language was different. There was no hesitation in his movements, no sign of doubt. He was confident, purposeful, and as he walked into the center of the room, Lawson felt a cold chill settle in his stomach. "Who the hell are you?" the leader demanded, his voice filled with suspicion. The newcomer's eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Lawson. He gave a small nod as if acknowledging his presence. Then he turned his attention to the leader. "We need to move forward," the newcomer said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "The time for talk is over." The leader seemed to hesitate, looking at the man for a moment as if unsure whether to trust him. Lawson could feel the shift in the room. This was no longer about just him. Something bigger was happening, something that involved all of them. "You sure about this?" the leader asked, his voice uncertain now. The newcomer nodded firmly. "We're going to send a message, and this is how it needs to happen. It's time to make an example. You wanted this, now we finish it." The leader swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between Lawson and the newcomer. Finally, he nodded. Though there was still an edge of doubt in his posture, Lawson's heart sank. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. He had hoped, even briefly, that the man in the corner might stand up and stop this. But it seemed the situation was beyond saving now. The room had taken a darker turn, and Lawson realized that whatever happened next would change everything. As the men began to move toward him again, Lawson's thoughts turned to his family, to his career, and to everything he had worked for. He had dedicated his life to upholding the law, to making the world a better place. But now, in this warehouse, surrounded by men who saw him as the enemy, he felt a sense of helplessness that he hadn't known before. The newcomer's presence had added a new layer of complexity to the situation, one that Lawson couldn't fully understand. Why had he come? What was his role in all of this? But there was no time to dwell on it. The leader was already signaling the others, their attention turning back to him. He had to act. He couldn't just sit here and wait. But in the face of such overwhelming odds, Lawson wasn't sure if anything he did would make a difference. Still, he had to try. He couldn't let these men believe that violence was the answer. He couldn't let them win, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in the warehouse was thick with tension. Lawson's chest felt tight, and his mind was a whirl of thoughts, each one trying to make sense of the chaos that surrounded him. The sound of boots on the cold concrete echoed in the silence, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the message these men wanted to send, a message that could ripple far beyond these walls. The newcomer, the man who had entered the warehouse with such confidence, stood near the leader. His presence was commanding, and Lawson could see the resolve in his eyes. This was someone who wasn't just part of the crowd. He was someone who believed in the cause, no matter how distorted it seemed. The leader seemed to defer to him now, as if his authority had shifted. It was clear that the man who had just arrived had more control than Lawson had realized. The way the others looked at him, almost with reverence, told Lawson that this was the man behind the plan, the one who had orchestrated this entire ordeal. "We need to move quickly," the newcomer said, his voice cutting through the thick silence. His gaze flicked to Lawson, and for a brief moment, Lawson saw something in his eyes, something that made him wonder if this man, despite everything, might still have a shred of humanity left. Lawson held his breath, waiting for the next move. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The door to the warehouse swung open again, but this time it wasn't another figure entering. It was the sound of sirens, distant at first but growing louder with each passing second. Lawson's heart leapt in his chest, and for the first time since he had been taken, a spark of hope flickered within him. The men in the room froze, their eyes darting nervously toward the door. The sirens weren't far now. Someone must have called for help. Lawson's mind raced as he realized that the authorities might be closing in. But would they get here in time? Would they be able to stop what was about to happen? "Get him out of here," the newcomer said, his voice sharp now. "We're not going to let anyone ruin this." The leader seemed unsure, glancing at the others in the room. For a moment it seemed like the entire situation was about to unravel. Lawson's pulse quickened. This was his moment, the chance he needed to survive. But before anyone could make a move, a voice rang out from the far corner of the warehouse. "Stop!" It was the man who had been hesitant earlier, the one who had seemed unsure about the violence. His voice was louder now, filled with a sense of authority that hadn't been there before. All eyes turned to him, and Lawson could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. "What are you doing?" the man demanded, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't right. We've gone too far already. We can't keep doing this." The room went quiet. The leader's face twisted with anger. But there was something different in the way he reacted. It was like he wasn't sure how to respond to the challenge. The other men shifted uncomfortably, their attention now focused on the man who had spoken out. Lawson held his breath, praying that this man would stand firm. He had seen enough to know that this was the turning point. If this man could convince the others to stop, to walk away from the violence, there was still hope. The newcomer's gaze locked onto the man, and for a moment, it felt like the entire warehouse was holding its breath. Finally, the newcomer spoke. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've already made our point. There's no need to go any further, but we're not backing down." The tension in the room was palpable, but Lawson could see the flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the men around him. The leader's face tightened, but there was no immediate response. The hesitant man stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "We're not going to solve anything with more violence. You've made your statement. But what comes next? What happens after we've hurt someone else? What's the endgame here?" The room remained silent for a long moment. Lawson's heart beat loudly in his chest as he watched the men around him. For the first time, there was a shift in the dynamic. The group was divided. Some of them were starting to question their actions, their purpose. The grip of hatred was loosening, just slightly, but it was enough to make a difference. The newcomer exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. He looked at the leader, then at the rest of the men. For the first time, he seemed less sure of himself, as if the words of the hesitant man had started to reach him. "We can still send a message," the newcomer said, his voice quieter now, "but maybe not this way." The leader stared at him for a long time, as if weighing the decision. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. Finally, he spoke. "Fine," the leader said, his voice sharp but resigned. "We stop here. But this isn't over. We'll find another way." With that, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate just a little. The men who had been so ready to carry out their plan looked uncertain now, their eyes flicking toward each other as if searching for guidance. Lawson couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was it possible that he had survived this? That the violence could be stopped before it went too far? The hesitant man moved toward Lawson, his hands shaking as he untied the ropes that bound him to the chair. Lawson blinked, still in disbelief. He hadn't expected this outcome. The fear and uncertainty in his mind were starting to lift, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. "You're free to go," the man said softly, his voice filled with regret. "But don't think this is over. We'll still make our voices heard. We'll find another way." Lawson nodded slowly, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. The sirens were getting closer now, and he could hear the sound of footsteps outside. The authorities were almost there. He was free, but he knew that the events of the past hours would haunt him for a long time. As the men filed out of the warehouse, Lawson stood there, taking in the gravity of the moment. He had been a prisoner, held by people who wanted to tear the system down. But in the end, it was their own doubt, their own humanity, that had saved him. The authorities arrived moments later, flooding the warehouse with flashing lights and the sound of shouting voices. Lawson didn't have the words to explain what had happened, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about him. It was about the world they lived in, and the choices people made when they felt that all hope was lost. As he was escorted out of the warehouse, Lawson looked back one last time, wondering how many others out there felt as these men had. Lost, angry, and desperate for change. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The battle for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur for Chief Justice Lawson. The world outside the warehouse seemed to spin with a kind of disorienting energy, as if everything had shifted overnight. The news stories that came flooding in were filled with speculation, theories, and outrage. But the one thing that everyone agreed on was that something had changed. Lawson found himself thrust into the center of it all. He had always been a figure of authority, a symbol of the justice system, but now he was part of a narrative that extended far beyond his control. The fact that he had been taken hostage, that his life had been threatened by those who felt abandoned by the very system he represented, was a story that resonated deeply with the public. As he sat in his office reviewing case files, his mind wandered. He thought about the men who had taken him, the faces of the men who had stood around him with cold eyes and trembling hands. It was clear now that their anger wasn't just about one person or one injustice. It was about the whole system, the way it had failed so many for so long. But Lawson wasn't sure where to begin. How could he fix something so broken? Where was he supposed to start? His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen to see a name he recognized. Detective Anderson. A sense of unease settled in his chest. He had been in contact with Anderson after the incident, but he had been careful not to delve too deeply into the details of the situation. The detective was one of the few people Lawson trusted in the wake of what had happened. "Hello?" Lawson answered. "Chief Justice," Anderson's voice came through the line, firm but tired. "We need to talk." Lawson sat up straighter in his chair, sensing the gravity in Anderson's tone. "What's going on?" "It's about the men who took you," Anderson said. "We've been investigating them further and we've found something disturbing." Lawson's heart rate quickened. "What do you mean?" "We've traced their connections. These men didn't just act on their own. They were part of a larger movement, a movement that's been growing for months, maybe longer. And it's not just a small group. There are more people out there, people who feel just as they did, disillusioned, betrayed by the system." Lawson felt a chill run through him. The realization hit hard. It wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a sign of something much bigger, something that had been festering beneath the surface for a long time. "You need to be careful," Anderson warned. "These people are organized and they have a plan. They're not going to stop just because you've survived. In fact, they may see you as a symbol of everything they want to tear down." Lawson exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "What do we do?" "We need to act quickly," Anderson said. "We need to find out who's behind this and stop it before it spreads further." Lawson nodded, his mind already racing with the implications. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the future of the justice system, the very fabric of society. The idea of a group, a movement growing in strength and numbers fueled by anger, and resentment was terrifying. What would happen if it wasn't stopped? What would happen if more people began to feel that same sense of betrayal, that same desire for vengeance? He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. "I'll do whatever it takes. I won't let this go unanswered." "Good," Anderson replied. "I'll keep you updated. Stay safe, Chief." As the line went dead, Lawson sat in silence for a long moment, processing the information. He had always known that the system wasn't perfect, that there were cracks in the foundation. But this was different. This wasn't just a few disgruntled individuals. This was a movement with an agenda. And if he was going to make a difference, he would have to act fast. The next few days were a whirlwind. Lawson met with Anderson and a team of investigators to discuss the next steps. They gathered information, analyzed the men who had taken him, and traced their connections. It became clear that the group wasn't some small fringe faction. It had deep roots, stretching into various parts of society, from local communities to disgruntled employees in government offices. They had been organizing in secret, building a network of supporters who felt that the system had failed them. The more Lawson learned, the more he understood just how deep the problem went. It wasn't just about a few individuals who had lost faith in the system, it was about a larger societal fracture, a growing divide between those who felt empowered by the law and those who felt excluded from it. But as the investigation progressed, Lawson also began to realize something else, something that disturbed him even more. These men, these people, weren't just angry at the justice system, they were angry at the very idea of justice itself. They saw the system as an institution that protected the powerful and punished the powerless. And that belief was driving them to extreme measures. One evening, Lawson sat in his office looking out over the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders, and for the first time in a long time he felt the full responsibility of his position. He wasn't just a judge anymore, he was a symbol of everything these people wanted to destroy. The thought terrified him. The idea that his every decision, his every move could be twisted into something that fueled the flames of this growing movement. It was a heavy burden, but as much as it scared him, he knew he couldn't back down. He had dedicated his life to upholding the law, to ensuring that justice was served. If this movement was going to succeed, it would be because the people who believed in the system had failed to stand up and fight for it. And he couldn't let that happen. The phone rang, pulling Lawson from his thoughts. He picked it up, already knowing who it was. Anderson's voice came through the line, steady but urgent. "It's happening," Anderson said. "We've identified a key member of the group. They're planning something big and we need to stop them before it's too late." Lawson stood up from his desk, his mind focused. "Where?" "They're gathering tonight. We have a location. We'll need your help." Without hesitation, Lawson grabbed his coat and headed out the door. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't afford to let this threat grow any larger. As he arrived at the location, the gravity of the situation became clearer. The area was secluded, a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Lawson's heart raced as he stepped out of the car, the weight of the moment settling on him. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. The team moved in silently, surrounding the warehouse. Lawson's mind raced as he thought about the people inside, the people who believed they had no other choice but to fight back, to tear down the very system that had failed them. But he wasn't going to let them win. Not tonight. The plan was simple. Move in fast, secure the area, and stop the leaders of the movement before they could execute whatever plan they had. Lawson could feel the pressure mounting, but he pushed it aside. He had been in high-stress situations before, but this was different. This was more than just one case. This was about the future of justice itself. The door to the warehouse swung open and Lawson's team flooded in, guns drawn. He could hear the sound of shouting from within, followed by the clatter of footsteps as the people inside scrambled to escape. But Lawson wasn't here to make arrests. He was here to make sure this madness ended. In the end, it wasn't the arrest that made the difference, it was the conversation. The dialogue that followed the chaos. The chance for these people to see the consequences of their actions, and the realization that violence would only perpetuate the cycle of anger they had been caught in. The confrontation was intense, but it marked the beginning of something larger. Lawson knew that this was only the start. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in days he felt like there was hope. Hope that change was still possible if the right people were willing to fight for it.